So I'd like to make an introduction and keep it kind of short because we have limited time. This kind of talk with a speaker of Professor Singer's profile could go on a longer time. We're going to go for an hour and a half, but within limits, we can stay a little bit longer because, well, we're committed to dialogue and openness and having people here that can engage us with difficult, interesting issues is something that we aspire to do. So I just want to start with a bit of a personal point about why I thought and share with our advisory board that it would be a good idea to bring Professor Singer here. I have a long history in activism and scholarship on human rights, and I've been teaching a human rights course for longer than I care to admit. It'll give my age away, but a long time. And throughout that whole time, I have used Professor Singer's work as the best argument against human rights as a way of proceeding to do good in the world or to live a good life. And what I mean when I say against, not that he doesn't like the idea or is emotionally visceral about the idea, but that fact that there are other ways in ethics and in presumably in practice and activism to do good in the world. Professor Singer is a leading exponent of utilitarianism in ethics, which in my view is the best critique of human rights almost since the time of Jeremy Bentham, if not before, in whatever form. So in keeping with John Stuart Mill's idea, which is in some ways the grounding of freedom of expression and the way one should live a dynamic intellectual life, my view is that if I hold an idea, no matter how dearly, I'm obligated to actively seek out views that counter my own, and which challenge my own views and my own understandings of how the world works. And in our class, we have read his recent book, The Life You Can Save, which is a part of his overall project to get people in affluent societies to be more generous and to share more, or what he calls effective altruism, to actually redistribute wealth, but not in the form of state necessarily. Maybe he does believe in that, I don't know, but not, at least in this book, not in the form of state appropriation of people's resources and then redistribution to other people, but people voluntarily saying, I have a lot, I am affluent, and I'm going to give more to save a life, or some lives. But one of the things I like particularly about the book, and what I try to impress on my human rights students, is that the book is not entitled How to Save the World. That's a very much more complicated project, and I'll spare you my thoughts on whether that's possible or not. The answer tends toward the negative. But what I like about the approach and what I like in terms of thinking about human rights is its decentralized, but nonetheless collective orientation toward helping people live better lives. So I also thought it would be important to have Professor Singer here as someone who is the embodiment of intellectual life in terms of asking difficult questions about the world and about the world about ethics, about how we should live, for which he has come under more than his fair share of controversy, attack, criticism, and anything else that you care to add. My position is that this is important for our community to hear how someone who has asked difficult questions and put himself out there without necessarily knowing the answers, by the way, can share with us about the experience of that. And if you haven't read it, I will ask you to go to our website and read an essay from the New York Review of Books called On Being Silenced in Germany. And it'll give you a much longer biographical historical sense of Professor Singer's intellectual odyssey. So I will leave it up to you to do more research about Professor Singer and his various accomplishments, and his reputation certainly precedes him. And so without further ado, I will turn the floor over to you. And thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I want to thank Professor Cushman and the Freedom Project for having brought me here. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank all of you for turning up, because there wouldn't be much point in being here if you weren't here too. So tonight I'm talking about philosophy, controversy, and the importance of free speech. And this is an important time to address that question, especially in universities and colleges, but not only in universities and colleges. Historically, the battle for freedom of speech has been a cause championed by the left and liberal side of the political spectrum against conservatives who wanted to limit the expression of radical ideas. In fact, the last time I spoke on this topic was about 10 years ago at the University of Pennsylvania, when I was awarded the Scott Nearing Prize by the Department of Politics there. You probably haven't heard of Scott Nearing. He was a radical economist who taught about the importance of closing the gap between rich and poor. This is in about the early years of the 20th century. And that wasn't very welcome to the wealthy trustees of the University of Pennsylvania and the Wharton Business School. And in 1915, he was dismissed from his position. Edgar Smith, who was then the university's provost, said academics should not spend their time meddling in political questions. Now, Nearing actually left the university, didn't go back to academic life, but together with his wife, Helen, they went to live on the land. They lived simply, they became vegetarians, and they became self-sufficient. And they wrote a book in the 1950s called Living the Good Life. And before I'd really knew anything about Scott Nearing and freedom of speech, I knew that book because I'm old enough to have come of age in the 60s and 70s when the hippies were going back to the land to live simply, drop out of society. And Living the Good Life became a sort of near Bible for those who wanted to go back to self-sufficiency. And perhaps thanks to their vegetarian diet, Helen and Scott Nearing were still alive in the 70s to see their work fully recognised. Now today, we still see some cases in which conservatives try to keep people from the left off campus. And in fact, I'm one of them, because when I was appointed to Princeton University in 1999, there was a lot of controversy about my views on abortion and euthanasia. And Steve Forbes, whose father had endowed one of the university's residential colleges, Forbes College, called for my appointment to be rescinded and pledged that he would not donate to the university as long as I was on the faculty. It's maybe relevant to that pledge that at the time he was running for the Republican nomination for president, the nomination that George W. Bush was successful in obtaining. Anyway, I'm still there. I'm trying to find out whether he's kept his promise. I'm not sure that he has, actually. But anyway, that's one example. But there have been more recent examples, too, of conservatives keeping radical people off. Professor Stephen Salita had been offered an appointment at the University of Illinois in 2014 when he posted tweets that were highly critical of Israel and of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the University of Illinois withdrew its offer of appointment as a result of those tweets. And only 2 months ago, Harvard's Kennedy School withdrew Chelsea Manning's appointment as a visiting fellow after the CIA Director Mike Pompeo, who incidentally, if you're reading the New York Times, the Times today said he was likely to replace Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State in the next few weeks. Mike Pompeo called Chelsea Manning a traitor and cancelled the lecture he'd been scheduled to give at the school, which prompted them, as I say, to withdraw her appointment. But we have recently seen a section of the left actively opposing freedom of speech. Here are 3 recent examples, one of which I'll then discuss in more detail. At Middlebury College in Vermont, Charles Murray, the co-author of the controversial book The Bell Curve about race and IQ, was shouted down, and actually as he and the professor who'd hosted him were walking away from the lecture, they were attacked and the professor was knocked down and suffered concussion. At Berkeley, there have been various protests about right-wing speakers, including the alt-right journalist Milo Yiannopoulos, who had a lecture cancelled after violent protests. And outside the universities, at Google, James Damore, a software engineer, was fired after he circulated a memo suggesting that there are differences between men and women that may explain, in part, why there are fewer women than men in software engineering. Well, what are we to make of all of this? We could echo the famous remark attributed, though I'm told erroneously attributed, to Voltaire: "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Or perhaps we should say that some speakers do cross a line and should not be tolerated. There's nothing like being silenced oneself to make one feel vividly the importance of freedom of expression. And as Professor Cushman mentioned, that has happened to me, and I will tell you a little bit about that. In 1989, and for a few years thereafter, announcements of lectures that I was scheduled to give in Germany and in other German-speaking countries, in particular Austria and the German-speaking part of Switzerland, led to protests and threats of violence that caused the complete cancellation of 2 entire conferences and the withdrawal at late notice of several invitations that I had received and accepted to speak at universities and conferences. In Zurich, on one occasion, I had to stop lecturing after I was physically attacked on the stage and my glasses were ripped off my face and smashed under the boot of a protester. Those protests were against my advocacy of permitting parents to make life and death choices for their severely disabled newborn infants, including, if they choose, the option of active euthanasia. But many of my German opponents were not interested in the reasons why a professor of philosophy might take that view. Rather, they held that, irrespective of the merits of the argument, it is impermissible to question the inviolability of human life in general, or the right to life of disabled human beings in particular. Some values, in other words, they said, were so sacrosanct that they must not be challenged. The objection to my views that these German opponents of mine were making is very similar to one discussed by John Stuart Mill in his famous defense of freedom of expression in On Liberty. Mill begins that defense by arguing that to prohibit disagreement with a widely shared view is to assume not merely that the view is true, but that we can infallibly know that the view is true. In other words, that we are claiming infallibility in seeking to prohibit opposition to that view. And Mill said we're never justified in claiming infallibility, because however obvious a view seems to us, however undeniable it may seem, it could be false. And Mill cited several historical examples where views had been accepted unquestioningly, but later turned out to be false. Mill also added that even if a view is true, to prevent it being challenged is to risk it becoming a dead dogma rather than a living truth. Mill also considers another ground why some people might want to suppress certain views. There are some, he tells us, who would deny the right to challenge a belief, not because they are certain that the belief is true, but because they believe it is indispensable to the well-being of society. and that only bad people would seek to weaken these beliefs. Mill replies that this objection seeks to separate the usefulness or otherwise of a view from the question of its truth. But surely, Mill says, we're no more infallible about the usefulness of a view than we are about whether it is actually true. We have to be able to discuss, again, whether a view really is indispensable for the well-being of society. I took that approach on one occasion during those years when I was able to have a fruitful discussion with some of those who had come along to my talk in order to prevent me speaking. This took place at the University of Saarbrücken under the auspices of Professor Georg Megler. The protesters had come along armed with whistles, which they blew when I was ready to speak, and they made so much noise that I was not really able to be heard. Professor Megler, who'd introduced me, returned to the microphone and invited one of the protesters to come on stage and explain why they thought I should not be heard. So they accepted that invitation, and one of them did explain that. The explanation revealed some misconceptions about what my views were. For example, the speaker seemed to assume that I was from the political right, some kind of neo-Nazi, whereas I've always situated myself on the left. And it also included the claim, more serious claim perhaps, that Germany's past shows the danger of regarding some human beings as more valuable or more worthy of life than others. After the spokesman for the protesters had been heard, Professor Megler said that in fairness I ought to be given a right of reply. And the protesters accepted that, and they did hear me reply. And I argued that no reflective society can really avoid raising the kinds of questions that I was raising, that my views about the sanctity of human life have arisen in a state of society where we now have medical technology that can preserve the lives of severely disabled infants, and for that matter of older adults, who previously would have swiftly died. And that the fact that we have that technology does not in itself mean that we ought to always use it. The fact that we can prolong life doesn't mean that we always ought to prolong life. And we need to ask whether our medical technology should always be used to preserve human life to the maximum extent possible. And if the answer is maybe not, and it's acknowledged that sometimes a patient is incapable of expressing a preference for continuing to live or die, as of course newborn infants are incapable of expressing such a preference, then you need to ask some important ethical questions, such as on what grounds should a decision to discontinue treatment, to not use or not start treatment, not use all the medical technology at our command, on what grounds should that decision be made? Should it be made on the basis of the quality of life the patient can be expected to have? And that is indeed how, in intensive care units all over the world, whether they're treating infants or non-competent adults, that is how those decisions very often get made. And then we need to discuss, if the patient can't make that decision and has not expressed an advance directive, who should make that decision? And finally, if indeed a decision is made to withdraw life support, knowing that that will bring about the death of the patient, is there really a moral difference between doing that and giving the patient a lethal injection? In other words, the kind of active euthanasia that I was advocating. Now, there's room for different views on all of these questions. But what I was trying to say to the protesters is, do you really not even want to discuss these questions? What view are you implying if you think these questions are not even ones that should be discussed in a free and democratic society. So I think we can talk about the usefulness of those views, but in fact it does lead, as it led on that occasion, to discussions also about the soundness or the truth of those views. But on one point here, my experience doesn't entirely support what Mill writes. He says, "It will not do to say that the heretic may be allowed to maintain the utility or harmlessness of his opinion, though forbidden to maintain its truth. The truth of an opinion is part of its utility." That's no doubt correct if we're talking about something that can be true or false. But some of my German opponents, at least, did not accept that. I should say my opponents in Germany came from two very different camps. On the one hand, there were conservative Christians who thought that what I was saying was wrong because it violated the Christian ethic of the sanctity of life. And on the other hand, there were people on the left who thought that what I was saying was wrong because they linked it with the Nazis and the Nazi program of so-called euthanasia. I would not use that label for it, but that was how it was called, for the intellectually disabled, which was simply a program really of getting rid of so-called useless mouths. So of those two groups, the Christians obviously did think that there was a truth on this question, and they thought that I was wrong, that they had the truth and that my view was false. But my opponents on the left had a different view because mostly they had a Marxist intellectual background, intellectual framework. And as they understood Marxism, there is really no truth or falsity in morality. It's all a matter of power. The dominant elite gets to impose their morality on the society as a whole, and they assumed that I was somehow speaking on behalf of the dominant elite, the industrial military complex or whatever it was, that didn't want to be put to the expense of supporting people with serious disabilities who are not going to be productive workers for the capitalist economy. So they didn't really think that this was a question of truth or falsity, but a question of power. And against that, really, Mill's point doesn't really apply. They don't admit that there is any truth here. They just want to make sure that they are a countervailing power, exposing the power of the ruling class. That view, of course, can be traced back, as I said, to Marx, but even further back to Plato's Republic, to Thrasymachus, who maintains that right is the interests of the stronger. But it has again become more popular in the last few decades because not only of Marxists, who I think intellectually are less influential now than they were a few decades ago, but because of postmodernists and deconstructionists and critical theorists of various kind, some of who do show a Marxist influence, but who essentially espouse a kind of relativism about morality that I don't think has much in the way of philosophical underpinnings, and that in fact would undermine their claims to interfere with freedom of speech, or that they're justified in interfering with freedom of speech, because if they make claims that what they're doing is justified, they're making a moral claim, and if my moral claims are relative, can't be true or false, then that same must apply to their moral claims. Once we grant that, though, once we say that there is no truth or falsity in morality, it's just the interests of the stronger, then of course we leave it to who is the stronger. And I think this is a very foolish tactic for the left to use in this society, because there seems to me no doubt that it is the right that is stronger in terms of sheer force. They have the big guns on their side. And if we are to make progress, I think it has to be through argument and persuasion, and that includes ethical argument. Okay. So far in arguing against those who tried to prevent me speaking and talking about that, I've been focusing on views that I believe to be sound or true. But you might say, what about views that are palpably false? As an example, let's take David Irving. If you've seen the recent film Denial, that's a film about the lawsuit that he brought against the historian Deborah Lipstadt, and the denial that the film's title comes from is the denial of the reality of the Holocaust. Not only was that lawsuit part of Irving's denial, but he has actually served time in prison for denying the Holocaust, because that is a criminal offence in Germany and Austria, and he was imprisoned in an Austrian prison for saying that the Holocaust never happened. The question is imprisoning somebody who says the Holocaust never happened the best way to persuade anyone who might still be in any doubt about the reality of the Holocaust that it did in fact happen? Why would that be persuasive? One might think it would rather influence people to think, oh, there must be something to hide here. Otherwise, why don't they, instead of imprisoning him, just debate him and show the evidence? And in this particular case, of course, the evidence is overwhelming and totally clear. Why don't they just debate him and show that evidence that the Holocaust did happen? That, I think, would be the most reasonable response. But you might say, and this will be relevant to things I'm going to say about our own situations later, you might say, to deny the existence of the Holocaust is deeply offensive to those who survived it, or to the descendants of those who were its victims. And it is offensive. There's no doubt about that. And I know it well because I am among those descendants. 3 of my grandparents died in the Holocaust. The 4th barely managed to live through it. Nevertheless, I agree with Mill when he says that causing offence is not a sufficient reason for restricting free speech, because there are so many different views which can cause offence that to impose that restriction, to say you're only free to say what you believe if you don't offend anyone, would utterly destroy freedom of expression. The benefits of freedom of speech outweigh the harms, and they are real harms, I don't deny that they're harms, but the benefits of free speech, I believe, do outweigh them. And sometimes we have to risk being offended, and people who are offended have to learn to live with that, as indeed I have in this case. This is particularly true of philosophy, which also has a long history of causing offence. That tradition goes back to Socrates in ancient Athens. The Oracle of Delphi said that Socrates was the wisest person. That puzzled Socrates because he realized that there were so many things he didn't know. And then he thought about it and talked to people about it, and he realized that he was the wisest person because he knew that there were so many things that he didn't know. Whereas all of the other people thought that they knew everything or that they knew a great deal, when in fact they didn't. So Socrates spent a lot of time demonstrating to his fellow Athenians how little they knew, that they didn't, for example, understand even a basic moral concept like justice, which is the subject of the Republic. And in pushing them to examine their ignorance, exposing their ignorance, he undoubtedly offended many of them. And for this, perhaps for this, I'm not a historian, but perhaps anyway, we do know that he was condemned to death by drinking hemlock, so perhaps he paid the price for offending his fellow Athenians, making himself unpopular. But I think we philosophers ought to accept that that is part of our tradition, that we want to challenge people, that we want to show people that they don't know as much as they think that they know, and we want to challenge them to examine their life. We want to ask them if they're living an ethical life, and that can also be an offensive question if we have a line of argument that suggests that perhaps they're not. And if we're to do that and do our job properly, then we need a license to cause offence. Still, you might say, there have to be some limits to free speech. And I think there are some limits. Mill thought that even opinions will lose their immunity when the circumstances in which they're expressed are such as to constitute their expression a positive instigation to some mischievous act, as he called it. He was referring, for example, to somebody who made a speech in front of the house of a corn dealer. Corn dealers were unpopular at the time, believed to be forcing up the price of corn and therefore the price of bread. Somebody made a speech in front of a corn dealer's house saying, "The corn dealers are starving the poor. They're greedy, etc. You know, they're causing the poor to starve for their own profits." That such an inflammatory speech could be prohibited. Although one might, Mill thought, publish the same opinion in a newspaper, and that would be protected. We're less worried today about violence to corn dealers and more concerned about incitement to racial or religious hatred. But I think it's consistent with the spirit of the line Mill was trying to draw to say that the right to free speech does not extend to a right to incite racial hatred, which can often lead to violence against racial or ethnic groups. And many countries in Europe, many European countries, my own native country of Australia, do have laws against racial vilification or incitement to racial hatred. It's more difficult here because of the First Amendment and its interpretation by the Supreme Court. But I think such laws can be justified, provided we interpret incitement to racial hatred or racial vilification narrowly, not in terms of the content of what is said so much as in terms of whether it is an incitement to hatred which is attempting to arouse emotions, arouse hostile emotions in people towards a racial or ethnic group. So hatred is an emotion. To try to arouse those hostile emotions seems to me to go beyond the bounds of protected speech, because it's not really an expression of ideas which might appeal to our intellect, but an appeal to our emotions. Granted, the line is not going to be easy to draw, and hard cases, of course, will go to the courts for determination. But I think the principle there is tolerably clear. It's also clear that at least some of the speakers and authors who've recently been prevented from speaking in the United States are not engaging in racial vilification as I've defined it. Charles Murray's work is not racial vilification, for it is aimed at our intellect. You just have to pick up the bell curve and look at it, and I think you will see that fairly soon. It presents complex evidence and makes arguments based on that evidence. Now, you may think that the evidence is selective and that the arguments are unsound. You may point out that some will find his conclusions offensive. All of that is true, but the proper response to this is to refute the evidence or to present contrary evidence and to point to holes in the argument. Again, as with jailing David Irving, I think if for people who are predisposed to believe that what Murray says is right, preventing him speaking is only going to reinforce their beliefs that he is right, and for that matter, it's also only going to give him more publicity than he would have got if people had gone along to the talk and debated with him, tried to refute what he was saying. And the more publicity he gets, the more books he sells. And indeed, it's been reported that there has been a resurgence of sales in the bell curve after the protest against him, after the events at Middlebury College in the spring, which prevented him speaking. So I think it is counterproductive to carry out that kind of response. At Middlebury last March, after these events, a number of faculty members wrote and signed onto a statement of principles under the heading Free Inquiry on Campus. The principles included such points as genuine higher learning is possible only where free, reasoned, and civil speech and discussion are respected. Only through the contest of clashing viewpoints do we have any hopes of replacing mere opinion with knowledge. The incivility and coarseness that characterize so much of American politics and culture cannot justify a response of incivility and coarseness on the college campus. And a protest that prevents campus speakers from communicating with their audience is a coercive act. The statement prompted a counter-statement by a group of Middlebury students entitled Broken Inquiry on Campus. The counter-statement critiques some of the principles that I just read. It offers us offers us an opportunity to examine the thinking of some of those who prevented Murray from communicating with the audience, many of whom at least had turned up to hear him. Here's one revealing passage that I'll quote. It's written in response to the faculty assertion that only through the contest of clashing viewpoints do we have any hope of replacing mere opinion with knowledge. To this, the students responded as follows. By elevating bigotry and engaging with it in open debate under the misguided view that all ideas must be respected, we risk elevating biased opinions with no solid factual foundation into the realm of knowledge and affirming the unconscious biases many hold. If we hold that the contest of clashing viewpoints is the only way to solidify knowledge, it naturally follows that we have a responsibility to articulate some parameters for which viewpoints are worthy of such a process. The students are here assuming that Murray's work consists of biased opinion with no solid factual foundations. But that's precisely what needs to be demonstrated. And by silencing Murray and preventing any debate, they miss the opportunity to demonstrate it. Perhaps instead of pressing their university's administration to cancel Murray's visit once it had been announced, they should have pressed for an opposing speaker, for a debate in which Murray and someone knowledgeable in the area who is opposed to his views, and there are many such people, would have shown that his views lacked solid factual foundations. The students also appear to believe that it's possible to articulate parameters for deciding which viewpoints are worthy to enter the contest of clashing opinions. Presumably, since Murray's work does, as I've said, attempt to appeal to our reason rather than to our emotions, the students must believe that these parameters can be set on the basis of an assessment of the content of the work, rather than, as I've suggested, its tone. But how is that to be done? How can you set parameters on the basis of the content of the work without debating and discussing that very content? And it's how well it is grounded. And importantly, we have to ask, why do the students think that they're in a position to decide this for others, for those who had come to the event to hear what Murray had to say, and presumably to hear other members of the community respond critically to it? If the students are simply asserting that they know that Murray is wrong, then Mill's assumption of infallibility or Mill, I should say Mill's critique of the assumption of infallibility is squarely applicable. That's not all that the students had to say on this matter. There's one more thing that I want to read to you, but it's something that cuts directly against what I've been arguing are key values for a university and for any community that values an open search for knowledge and truth. The students wrote, "We contend that experiences and emotions are valid ways to see the world, and that the hegemony of rational, thought-based perspective, often found in a university, sets limits to our collective creativity, health, and potential. If we are to move from opinion to knowledge, it is truly imperative to listen, understand, and reflect upon the various lenses members of our community use to view the world." Of course, it is important to know how other members of our community, and for that matter, of other communities, view the world. And that includes knowing what they are experiencing and what emotions they are feeling. But I think we should firmly reject the claim that emotions are valid ways to see the world. And we should uphold what is here being critically referred to as the hegemony of rational thought. Otherwise, we open the door to all the nationalist, racist, and sexist emotions, which, as we saw only too clearly in the 2016 presidential election, are widely held in this country, and which continue to be regularly tweeted to more than 40 million followers by the President of the United States. I'm sure the students who wrote Broken Inquiry on Campus don't regard Donald Trump's emotional and biased tweets as valid ways to see the world. But without rational thought, how can we decide which emotions are valid ways of seeing the world and which are not? I do need to respond to one ground that the students give for disrupting Murray's speech rather than presenting arguments against his views. They ask, is it reasonable for students or community members to be asked to debate someone who's presented their intellectual inferiority as an irrefutable fact? The reference, of course, is to Murray's claim that there is a genetic basis for the lower average IQ scores of African Americans when compared to whites. I'm not aware of any place in which Murray has presented this as an irrefutable fact, though I don't claim to have read everything that he's written. But I presume that he would acknowledge the possibility of new evidence emerging that would refute his views. He no doubt thinks that that's highly unlikely, but I don't think he would regard it as beyond the bounds of possibility. It's also important, in regard to the claim that he is presenting, and as an irrefutable fact, the inferiority of those who are going to be present at the debate, the intellectual inferiority, it's also clear to say that Murray is talking about averages and not about the intellectual inferiority of any particular African American. And it is, of course, obvious, and Murray states it, that some African Americans are intellectually superior to most whites. Nevertheless, I accept that it can be troubling for African Americans, and indeed for anyone hoping for a more egalitarian and less racially divided society, to hear claims that there are genetic differences in intelligence that align in any respect, to any degree, with racial differences. But is this a reason for not allowing such claims to be discussed in a university? I've already given some reasons why I think preventing Murray from speaking was a bad idea, which only gave him more publicity and passed up an opportunity to refute him. But I want to give one more will tell one more story of somebody else who would agree that it was wrong to silence him. Last month, Yale University dedicated a new residential college named for Pauli Murray. I believe, as far as I know, no relation to Charles Murray. Pauli Murray was born in 1910. She was the granddaughter of a slave. She became a civil rights activist. She spent time in jail for refusing to sit in the Negro section of the bus. She led sit-ins to desegregate white-only eating places in Washington, D.C. When she studied law at Howard University in the 1940s, she was the only woman in the class, and her professors were also all male. One of those professors announced to the class that he didn't know why a woman would want to study law. She graduated first in her class and applied to Harvard Law School to do graduate work, only to be turned down because at that time Harvard Law School did not admit women. She did her own legal research on segregation, and that research was later drawn on by the legal team that won the landmark desegregation case, Brown versus Board of Education. Later, Pauli Murray was a co-founder with Betty Friedan of the National Organization for Women. But what's her relevance to what we're talking about today? Well, in 1963, Pauli Murray was studying for a doctorate at Yale Law School when the Yale Political Union invited George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, to speak on campus. In his inaugural speech as governor, Wallace had called for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And in the wake of that speech, members of the Ku Klux Klan bombed a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 African American schoolgirls and injuring 22 others. Many blamed Wallace for inciting violence. By this time, opposing segregation had been Pauli Murray's life work for more than 20 years. She had described segregation as a monster dividing peoples, thwarting personalities, breeding civil wars. She said that she would picket any event at which Wallace spoke. Nevertheless, she wrote to the president of Yale, urging him not to compromise, quote, not to compromise the tradition of freedom of speech and academic inquiry by preventing Wallace speaking on campus. Her experience in the civil rights movement had given her a strong sense of the importance of maintaining these rights for everyone. In her letter to the president of Yale, she wrote, I quote, "This has been the principle behind the enforcement of the rights of the Little Rock Nine." They were the first people to go to a previously segregated high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. James Meredith is the first African American to go to the University of Mississippi, and others to attend desegregated schools in the face of a hostile community and threats of violence. This same principle must operate equally in the case of Governor Wallace. Pauli Murray was an African American woman living in a climate of racism and sexism more hostile than anything that exists in this country today. And she was fully aware of how mistaken and harmful racist and sexist views are. Yet this did not lead her to seek to suppress them, nor did it blind her to the fundamental importance of freedom of thought and freedom of expression. We should follow her example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to have a Q&A period, and I ask everybody who'd like to ask a question to queue at the microphone here to get up and come. And also keep in mind that there are a lot of people here who might want to speak, and we have limited time, so if you keep your comments reasonably concise and to the point, that would be much appreciated. That's a utilitarian view, by the way.
And I meet you in person.
Great, but I think we're going to have some questions. Maybe you'd like to join the line?
No, I'm trying to join the line.
Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming today. So I have a very quick question. As a philosopher, do you think that there's an ethical distinction between expressing a belief publicly and advocating for action or policy based on that belief?
There's certainly a distinction between expressing a belief publicly and advocating policy, yes. So in this context, as I've said, I think that there ought to be freedom of expression, and that expression would cover beliefs and what one thinks would be the best policies. So if somebody says, I think this is the policy we ought to have, then I think they should be free to express that view. Now, when it comes to the implementation of that policy, then certainly one might try to block the implementation of that policy. So, as for example, Pauli Murray recognised Governor Wallace's right to speak, but if Governor Wallace, as Governor of Alabama, tried to maintain the segregation of high schools, as he did, she certainly would have tried to do what she can to prevent him doing that. As a lawyer, she might have done that, and successfully she and others did do that by suing through the federal court system. But one can also imagine following Martin Luther King's example and using civil disobedience to prevent racist and segregationist policies being implemented. I think one has a perfect right to use civil disobedience in those sorts of situations. So that would be a difference. In civil disobedience, one is not preventing other people from speaking. In fact, one is, I would say, in a sense, exercising one's own freedom of expression by showing how seriously you take this issue, that you're prepared to break the law and prepared, as Martin Luther King always did, to accept the punishment that is meted out to you for breaking the law, because that demonstrates your sincerity and strength of commitment. Thank you.
Hello, I need to get out my notes here because I wanted to get this question right.
Good.
So just bear with me. I'd be interested to hear your assessment of the platform argument, which is, specifically, I want a clarification on 2 points. Do you believe that there's a functional difference between inviting a speaker, for example, on a campus, or allowing them simply to be heard? For example, if someone were invited by the administration of Wellesley College to speak as a commencement speaker, versus if someone was asking the administration to take action to prevent a speaker from speaking who had been invited already by a different group? Do you think there's a functional difference? And secondly, early on in your speech, you mentioned Mr. James Damore, formerly of Google, and I would like to hear if you think that there is a distinction between expressing your views as a private individual and expressing your views as affiliated with a particular larger body of people. For example, I believe that in this case, Alphabet, the parent company of Google, was particularly worried that his views would become associated with their own. Do you think that should be a concern?
Good, thank you. Two very good questions. So, in terms of the difference between inviting a speaker, giving a speaker a platform, and trying to prevent a speaker that some student group, let's say, has invited, I do think that there is a difference. Because when one considers inviting a speaker, and I would say this applies to the student groups themselves as well as to the administration, then one has a choice, and one needs to think not only about is there a right to freedom of speech, but how to exercise that choice wisely and in a way that is going to do some good. Now, that might mean inviting the speaker that you agree with because you think that speaker's views are not well enough known and you want to give the speaker a platform because you think those views should become better known. It might sometimes, though, and perhaps this is something that the Freedom Project does, it might sometimes mean that we want to have a speaker whose views perhaps are not ones we agree with, but And for all I know, that might be the case with my views and Professor Cushman's invitation, I don't know. But one that people ought to hear and then will stimulate people to think and to argue about. So I think one can have those sorts of decisions. And certainly I think there would be some speakers that I would say, you know, I would think you ought not to invite. I mentioned the protests against Milo Yiannopoulos speaking at Berkeley, right? That's an example of someone who, if I were running a university administration, I would never invite, because I don't think he's a serious thinker putting forward ideas. He's a provocateur. And the same would be true if I was a student group. I wouldn't invite him. But on the other hand, if the college Republicans or some other student group did invite him, I would not think that one ought to try to suppress, prevent him speaking. I would think one ought to try and expose him as well one can, the shallowness and weakness of his thought. Now, in the case of James Dalmore, well, the question you asked was whether there's a question about somebody speaking in a way that will be associated with the organisation. Yes, I think that is a different issue. So I think if somebody put out a media release in the name of Google that did not represent Google's views or Alphabet's views, certainly that would be a dismissible offence. But I don't believe that James Dalmore did that. As I understand it, he circulated an internal memo to Google staff, which other people then gave to the media, which became public. Now, Google or Alphabet might well have worried that it would be associated with Google, but I don't think that dismissing him is the only way to make the disconnect clear. I mean, they could have issued a strong statement saying, we don't believe this. Better still, they could have issued a strong statement showing the contrary evidence that would have weakened his case that this was so. But to me, dismissal is a penalty that does stifle freedom of discussion within the organisation. Thank you.
Hi, so, sorry, I'm sick. You brought up the Charles Murray incident at Middlebury, and in fact, you structured a lot of your speech tonight around it. And I was just wondering why particularly you thought that this was an incident that was conducive to your argument, because from where I'm standing, the college did not impose on his right to free speech. He had a book published, and unfortunately in the world we live in today, it's not an option to not interact with ideas like his. In fact, ideas like his have been the prominent thinking for hundreds of years.
Well, certainly he had a book published, but I think it's clear that it wasn't the college, it was a group of students, according to the reports I've seen, perhaps 100 students, who didn't simply protest, but actually disrupted the talk, drowned him out, prevented him speaking. And I think those students did interfere with his freedom of speech, and they interfered with the opportunity that he had to interact with that audience. I'm not actually sure how big the audience is, but the audience beyond those 100 who didn't want to allow him to speak, who had come along to hear him, and quite possibly they also interfered with the freedom of speech of people in that audience who had come along precisely armed with objections to what he was saying. So I think to prevent a speaker who has been invited to campus to express his views and his ideas and have that exchange with the audience is an interference with freedom of speech, even if he has other opportunities through, as you say, publishing his book, to get those ideas across. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I just want to also play the devil's advocate a bit over here. Yeah. Okay. So you said that, according to Mill and you, an exception to free speech would be when the speaker is trying to make an emotional rather than rational appeal, and Murray, whatever his flaws, is making a rational appeal. But could one argue, and furthermore, you said that if you try to censor speech based on its content, the very act of censorship would be discussing the merits of its context. However, when you're trying to, in a world where you do try to decide which speech will be exposed based on how good the evidence is, you are not, while like a bunch of professors are debating it, they're not necessarily exposing it to the public. And couldn't one argue that the very idea, that the very existence someone talking to a large crowd, publicizing their views, and standing on an equal one-to-one platform with someone with an expert in the field, as if they're both experts, could be an emotional appeal, just in the sense that people are emotionally listen to experts, especially, say, when you're talking about someone like, I don't know, like an anti-vaccine person whose whole thesis might be they're trying to cover it up, don't trust these experts. The idea that this person is standing right next to an expert, and even if they may have a sort of rational but wrong evidence perspective, the debate itself, people are going to tend to use emotional tactics. People just look at Donald Trump saying so many facts at once that Hillary Clinton had to go, oh, look it up on HillaryClinton.com. When you try to engage someone in a debate, it can sometimes just come at you with false evidence and to claim that you're fabricating everything and covering things up so quickly that you don't have time to refute that, and it creates a sort of unintentional emotional appeal where it looks like the expert is flabbergasted, like they're hiding something.
Okay. Well, I think you're right that you can have debates which start out as intellectual, rational debates and break down into more emotional exchanges. You're right that that can happen. I think that one ought to try really hard to avoid that, and I think it is possible to avoid it. I've certainly had exchanges with people who have very different views from mine, and yet we've had useful exchanges.
Say, how would you handle an anti-vaccine person, for example?
Yeah, okay, an anti-vaccine person is an interesting example. So I would not myself, obviously, get into that debate. I'm not expert enough. I would hope that somebody who is expert on vaccines and can marshal the evidence would be the opponent. And I think that there is good evidence that would show that the dangers of vaccines have been greatly exaggerated, that when children are not vaccinated, we've had measles outbreaks because of that, that there's also a public health risk, that they impose risks on other people. So I think that you can have that debate, although I'm not sort of trying to ignore the difficulties in some of these issues, and sometimes people are going to be left confused. I'm not running the line that in any rational debate the right side always wins. That would be too optimistic. But I still think that you have to try to have that debate. You have to maintain those standards, otherwise you're never going to get to the bottom of those problems. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to try to make it as concise as possible, but I'm going to make some premises and build up to the question, because I think that it's a little bit more complex than just laying it in one sentence. So I do agree that the freedom of speech and ultimately denying anyone the right to speak about anything is the slippery slope that we can't go down to. But also not acknowledging that speech comes with power and power comes with speech. I think that that is the kernel that we're trying to get to here, because we know that the foundations on the basis of which some people have more opportunity to speak than others are very much in place in this society and around the world. And if we think about how the cultural systems that are created on the basis of speech, and in particular neoliberalism, which is forming not only an economic and a lifestyle homogeneity around the world, but also a cultural and psychological homogeneity around the world, is maybe a passive but still very effective way to silence, not to silence, but to change fundamentally ways of thinking. So my question here is, I'm not denying that we should give everyone the opportunity to speak. I am questioning the scope of this talk and what is being addressed to, because we are here speaking about, the liberal left denying many people the right to speak in these days. And I do think that our generations need to mature emotionally in order to truly understand what we are trying to go against to. So also silencing anything that offends us, that's not proposable. But looking at a situation right now where we have major international conflicts and which the United States itself has passed bills such as countering foreign propaganda, or the very actual current situation with the net neutrality, I am then asking, shouldn't the question be coming from how do we address the reason why these people are protesting against freedom of speech in the first place? Because there is obviously a power imbalance that, with the economic imbalances, is just getting stronger. And I think that this talk in particular could have done such a better job, for example, if it addressed the root causes of that inequality in the first place. So, if we are such champions of freedom of speech, shouldn't we be getting to the fundamental roots of the capitalistic nature of speech, the capitalistic nature of media, the power imbalances that have been there for a very long time and that are still growing, and how are we just focusing on a reaction to that situation instead of tackling the fundamental problem itself?
Thank you very much. Okay, so Professor Cushman said in introducing me that one of the things he liked about my book, The Life You Can Save, is that it wasn't called The World You Can Save, it was called The Life You Can Save. And it was an appeal to people to do the things that they can do, that we have it within our power to do, to make the world a better place. And I think I was doing something similar in what I was saying this evening. I was talking about things that we may be caught up with in our part of the world, on campuses, and talking about free speech. And I was talking about how to try to move that in what I see as a desirable direction. I wasn't talking about capitalism and the many problems of capitalism, let alone was I talking about how we can overcome capitalism and get rid of it.
But is that not the main problem, actually?
Well, whether it's the main problem or not, what is your recipe for how we get rid of it, right? Because I don't have a clue, actually, I have to say. Nobody, you know, maybe you'll be the first to give me a clear answer to this question, but nobody ever has.
Maybe instead of focusing on the problems of the left reacting to an imbalance, the ones who already have the power to, direct the speech in a certain way should be standing up against net neutrality in a way that goes fundamentally to the economic structures of speech and how it is allowed and how it is able to propagate in certain ways but not in others. So we know that some people are allowed to appear on major news outlets such as the New York Times or the Washington Post, and others are not. And the outlets that right now are much more under attack than others are the ones who are propagating narratives that are extremely uncomfortable, particularly for the elites whose benefits derive from the ability to control information and how people think and how the speech flows. So I think that one way to counter it would have been for you to acknowledge this central piece of the picture and to speak about that and to direct that power to bring all the force of the argument that you're making, which is a very powerful argument, but to direct it to the very reason why the imbalance exists.
Yeah, no, I think actually your analysis of the imbalance and your claim that it's getting greater isn't served by the very example you chose. I mean, the New York Times has far less influence now than it had 20 or 30 years ago. And you only have to look at how thick it was, right? The Sunday New York Times used to be a heavy load to carry home. It's lost all that advertising revenue. It's barely breaking even. It's basically calling on people to donate to it or donate student subscriptions. It's almost become a non-profit organization. And social media have taken up a lot of that slack, both in advertising and in the sense, like it or not, and certainly we've seen how it can be manipulated, but actually democratizing, because people who have no power accept the power to get something going that spreads virally, start to have a large voice where previously they didn't. So I don't think your analysis that somehow there are these institutions like the New York Times that have accumulated more power to themselves, I don't think that's right. If I had given a speech about where are some people with money and power having too much influence, and where has the interpretation of free speech in this country gone wrong, I would have talked about the Citizens United case, because that's the case which opened up politics to the Koch brothers and all of the other billionaires to put as much money as they want to into supporting the right-wing causes that they espouse, and has contributed, I think, to the dire political situation that this country is in today. But, you know, that would have been a different speech, I think. That wasn't the speech that I came here to give. I'm not saying that, you know, it isn't a good speech to give. Maybe it is, but it's a different one.
Just to conclude, I think that it would be a good step forward to critique, for example, the restrictions being put on net neutrality and the various dynamics that are currently reinforcing the power structures that spur the protest in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I was thinking about a little bit earlier to what you said about people taking offense to things, and this might be a little bit crude, but I was wondering what you thought about the merits of being politically correct and how that kind of may hinder or be valuable to free speech, because I do think sometimes that people want to speak freely, but they feel like because they're not as well versed in certain issues or whatever, and they're afraid of being not politically correct or being too politically correct, that sometimes they won't speak as freely as they would. So I was wondering if you could speak to the merits of that.
Yeah, I think we ought to try to break down that sense of political correctness. I think it's a kind of group conformity that does exist on some issues, that there are things people will not say. And, you know, certainly we should be aware of others and of their sensitivities, and as I said, of not causing offence unnecessarily. That's certainly valid. But sometimes political correctness does stifle speech and does prevent us raising issues that we may think about privately, but not actually debate openly. So I do think you should, you know, in any group, groups that are ideologically aligned, there's a danger that you'll form this sort of ideology that you don't really want to say certain things, and that can be a bad thing for any group. Thank you.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you for coming to talk to us today. The ancient Athenians had a practice where they would sometimes expose their babies, kill those they felt were unfit to be alive for a period of days after their birth. In your book, Practical Ethics, you note that a similar practice should be legal today, and I just wanted to ask you how you decide what lives are worth living and which ones aren't.
Okay, let me just correct one thing. I certainly don't think we should expose infants on hillsides. Obviously, you know, in fact, they weren't killing the infants. They were making this, I think, spurious distinction between killing and allowing to die, or killing and letting nature take its course. And of course, when nature takes its course, as it would have with these infants, they would have either, I don't know, starved to death or been picked apart by vultures or something like that. I mean, a horrible death. It would have been much kinder of the Athenians to kill them immediately by some humane method. So I'm certainly not advocating what the Athenians did. Secondly, though, you asked me, how do I decide which lives are worth living? My answer to that is, I don't. What I advocated, and what I've consistently advocated, is that the parents of children born with serious disabilities, in consultation with their doctors, after getting all the information, and ideally also consulting with families of people who have children with this condition or have had children with this condition, so they really get that range of perspectives, should be able to make that decision. I don't want to make that decision, and I think it does depend also, it's very important, whether the parents, understanding the kind of life their child will have, can accept that and can say, yes, we want to be as loving and good to this child as possible and give this child the best possible life, because that makes a huge difference then to the quality of that child's life. On the other hand, if the parents say, no, we could never cope with such a child, we would have to hand that child over to the state to foster out, or in previous days to put in an institution, then that's likely to be a much worse life. So I think it's vital that the parents and the doctors should make those decisions in the case of infants, as I was saying, which is the case you were talking about. And in the case of older people, I think, you know, we should be able to make those decisions. We should make them as advance directives, or if we're competent at the time, we should be able to ask a doctor for assistance in dying, as is now legal for, I think it's about 60 million Americans. If you add California, Washington, Oregon, Vermont, Montana, I think, Colorado. So it's a significant part of the country, all of Canada, various countries in Europe, and as of this week, in fact, my home state of Victoria in Australia has also legalised physician assistance in dying. So, in that case, I think it's the patients who are to make that decision.
So how do you address your critics who say that that position is discrediting the lives of people who are disabled?
Well, I think that that's really a misunderstanding of the position, because I certainly would never suggest of any person who has a disability who is able to consider the question, do I want to go on living or not? I would never suggest to that person that he or she should not go on living.
But isn't that position implicitly implying that their lives aren't as valuable as normal people?
No, I don't think it implies that. I think it implies that we have decisions to make at birth. As I said, we have decisions about whether to put a baby on a respirator, whether to withdraw the respirator at some point. Those decisions are being made already. And of course, women also make decisions during pregnancy on the basis of prenatal diagnosis. So, you could say that all of those decisions can imply that life with a disability is not as good as life without a disability, or something like that. If you really followed through on that, I think you would probably want to say that women should not terminate pregnancies after receiving information that they're carrying a fetus who will have a disability. That seems to me to be pretty far-reaching, and I think if we were to reflect on that, we would say, look, sometimes a life that hasn't really begun, maybe it's better that it not go ahead. So does that reflect a judgment? I don't think it reflects a judgment about whether anybody, as I say, capable of that decision should decide that their life is worthwhile. I think we should respect that decision. I think we should support that decision by doing everything we can to enable that person to live a full life, and a life that is integrated with the rest of the community, and often we don't do enough to do that. But I think it's a different issue when we're talking about a life that hasn't really begun, in the sense of the capacity to think about yourself and to judge your own quality of life and to think about your own life doesn't really exist as yet.
And you believe that period is after birth as well?
I think that period has a brief window after birth. Yes, I would say that too.
Okay,
yep,
thank you.
Hello
Okay,
again.
I have a few questions. Sorry. Okay, first of all, considering the infant question, is it necessarily true that, like you said, is there a particular line where people are able to be self-aware and contemplate the question of, do I want to live or not? But how do we know that that's necessarily the same point as the line where someone's life becomes so unquestionably that their disability is not so bad that there's really any question that their life wouldn't be worth living? What happens if all the doctors agree that someone is not suffering, just that they won't be able to? Let's say there's an infant who all the doctors agree will be not able to do much at all, but there's no reason to think they're suffering. However, their parents are really overwrought and miserable, and perhaps mom has postpartum depression. I don't know, but they personally have this instinct for the child to die. How can they be said to be able to the parents be said to make an informed decision in that case, even though this infant, though they're not capable of realizing it, will live a life worth living, and everyone agreed with it? Why should we just say, oh, the parents wouldn't like it, so we should let them kill the kid? Second question is, what did the intention of the speaker mention in terms of freedom of speech? Such as, let's say you invite someone to speak and then it gets discovered they're actually from Russia, trying to sow chaos in America for Putin to do better. Even though they were using a rational argument to that mean rather than emotional, how did that affect things? Okay, third question. This is based on. Okay, my last, this is the most important one I feel, based on the life you can save and stuff, based on our position as college student, what do you think from a utilitarian perspective would be the best major we should take to help save the most lives and make the largest positive difference in the world?
Okay, on the last one, obviously I think philosophy is a great major to take. It not only because of the particular content, but it is something that helps you think. And I think that's really important. But you have to think about your own abilities and what you're going to enjoy taking. And I think that's also important. And there's a whole lot of things that are useful and valuable, and I'm not going to put down some rather than others. I've been interested in the areas like development and global poverty and overcoming that. So working in that area is important. Working on things like international relations to produce peace and a better world is also important. Biomedical stuff is important because you can go and do research that can find ways of reducing the burden of disease. I think all of those issues are really important. I think I'm already blurring on your previous questions. I know you were concerned about decisions about when a child becomes self-aware or self-conscious. I agree that there's no real line to have at that point. It's not a sharp line, and I think we should err on the safer side. That's why I said a relatively brief window. And then you asked about parents who just are overwrought. I think you mentioned postpartum depression. I certainly don't think parents should make this decision in a state of postpartum depression. I think that's not going to be a good thing. You should try to treat the person in that state and try and get them out of it. And maybe they can make a decision when they come through it still. Maybe that depends how long that takes, whether you would do that. So, I mean, that certainly is a complication. But I do think these are decisions for people to make who are not suffering from clinical depression or other clinical conditions that could cloud their judgment.
We have only one person in queue, and we're running out of time. So.
Okay, you're going to be the last question.
Pressure's on. Well, thank you so much for coming and speaking. I really enjoyed the lecture. I was really interested to hear you mention Citizens United, the case, because I think that's one of the landmark cases in which free speech potentially has excesses. And I would first of all be interested to hear your opinion on that particular case and the ways in which campaign finance may influence free speech, and if that is an example of a time when we should limit free speech. And then the follow-up would be just if you grant that the Citizens United case indicates that we should not allow large companies to sway public opinion implicitly, that there's not sufficient declaration of who is swaying public opinion, and therefore the fact that some people have larger megaphones implicitly means that their free speech should be limited. Whether that conclusion has implications for limiting the free speech of other public individuals that may sway public opinion because they have a large megaphone, like Christopher Cantwell, one of the leaders of the Charlottesville extremist movement, or Mark Zuckerberg on the other side at Facebook, the ways in which these people can also, with their free speech, have undue influence.
Okay, that's a good, interesting set of questions to close on. So I think the question of money in politics is to some extent a separable issue from the other ones. And I think, I think that it's a stretch to interpret free speech as saying that it's wrong to have any limits on how much people can donate politically. And there are many other countries which I regard as just as free in their democracy and, in fact, more democratic in some ways, as I'll explain in a second, and just as free in their freedom of speech, that do have laws on how much people can donate, and particularly how much corporations can donate. Because democracy does rely on the idea of one person, one vote, and the idea that simply because you have more money, you can therefore have a right to have more influence on the political process seems to me to count against that. So, you could say there's an important principle pushing against the idea that somehow having limits on campaign funding is a restriction on free speech. And I agree with you. I think that was a very bad decision and a wrong turning that the Supreme Court has taken, and I think we are going to live with the consequences of it, sadly, for some time to come. But I do think that it's separable from the idea that some people have a bigger megaphone in the way you were talking about it. In fact, I think in the case of the white supremacists, this is, again, one of the reasons why I opposed the violent attacks on Charlottesville, which did come from both sides, because that gave an incredible amount of publicity to the white supremacists and led to the President of the United States saying that some of them were fine people. He sort of half backed away from that statement, but half didn't. And I think, as I say, that's predictable that this is going to happen. So, as I said, it's happened with Charles Murray, and it happened with me in Germany. So the sales of my book, Practical Ethics, before those protests stopped me speaking, where I have to say sales of the German translation of it in Germany were minuscule. And after those events happened and they got into the newspapers and on television, they went up very appreciably. And so I'm the beneficiary in this case, but I think that's likely to happen. So the way to stop somebody having a large megaphone, so it relates to what you said, is not to sort of violently try to prevent them having free speech. I think, arguably it might be to ignore them altogether, but that could be a dangerous tactic. I think it's to maybe oppose them in a way more reminiscent of the civil disobedience movement, to be passive and quiet and show that you're resisting them, but you're resisting them in a dignified and peaceful way. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for coming at the end of term, and especially thank Professor Singer for coming and giving such an interesting talk. I hope the discussion won't stop there, and if everybody agrees, well, that would be very boring. So I hope that the conversation will continue in various ways around the campus. I wanted to mention that we have a book over here. It's a Freedom Project mailing list. If you'd like to get on the mailing list, put your email on there, and we'll send you our newsletters. And we're also planning some rather interesting events for the spring. I'll keep you in the dark for now, in mystery, but some of them I think will be very interesting for all members of our community, and we're working hard to make sure that we talk to different constituencies in the community. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for your support this semester. Thank you.
And I'd just like to add, I want to thank you all for coming too, but I also particularly want to thank all of those who asked questions. I thought it was a great set of questions. Thank you.